Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Ben Jewell. I'm an extension educator based in Otoe County, Nebraska, and welcome you here to our Nebraska Extension Regional Food System Initiative speaker series. Each month, September to May, we host someone to talk about their projects, their research, something going on in the food system in Nebraska. So we welcome you and excited to have you today. I'm going to be talking about a project that I started this last year during the farmers market season, collecting pricing on some common fresh vegetables, fruits and vegetable items at farmers markets here in Nebraska, kind of reporting out on what we experienced and what we saw and kind of what we learned from that process and kind of leading into what we're going to do next in 2026. So if I welcome you, thanks for being here, and just feel free to, if you've got questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and I'm happy to stop at any point during this. So go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, we started a project here at NERFSI this last year, collecting prices on fresh fruits and vegetable items at farmers markets across the state. And so just to kind of contextualize a little bit, why would we want to do that? Well, pricing is kind of one of the more critical pieces of the marketing activities of small farmers. Obviously setting the right price is really critical for maintaining profitability. It helps to communicate the value of your products to your consumers. Obviously, we can't run a business in debt, so you got to find the right price that covers your cost of production and expenses and things like that. It's also the case that there's really no existing data out there that, particularly, well, especially in Nebraska, but in most of the country, there's no data sets out there on direct-to-consumer prices like at farmers markets and in other forms of direct-to-consumer marketing. So we have a real gap in information out there. Um, and kind of we see this as one piece of missing critical data infrastructure that's kind of lacking for local food systems across the country as a whole. When you think about the difference between commodity farming and the commodity industry versus local food systems and the local food industry, we really don't have a lot of great data and information out there that can help inform producers on how to price their products in a way that's going to meet consumer demand and things like that. So we're really kind of lacking a lot of infrastructure here and data. So this is kind of just one step, one small piece of trying to address that lack of data information and infrastructure. And so kind of drawing here from a previous project that I did, had worked on a few years back, where we kind of dug into this issue of access to data and information for specialty crop producers in the Midwest and Southeastern United States, and really kind of started to tap into some of this kind of idea of there being a data value chain. Much like we have a value chain for food products that we move across the state, there's a value chain for data and information, and it's really pretty critical. And so, kind of from that research, this image comes from the Open Data Watch organization, a nonprofit that does a lot of great work on compiling and presenting data in ways that are very usable. So we really started to kind of understand that there's this process that data goes through from the collection phase all the way here on the left side. You'll see that arrow there, and we start to think about, so who gets to determine what data is collected and what questions are asked, and, kind of what is the process when you think about the USDA and the farm census and all this data that gets collected, who's kind of in charge of determining which data pieces are collected, and why is it that way? So that's from the collection of data phase to what you might call the publication phase. This is where everything gets analyzed and released. Start to think about, how is that data shared out with potential end users? What improvements could be made in that process? Through this project, we found that a lot of folks there's this disconnect right here at this kind of production and releasing of information and data stage to the uptake by end users, in this case, specialty crop producers. So you might be the USDA and putting out a whole bunch of data sets, but that doesn't mean that your end users are actually accessing them and making good use of them. We wanted to kind of understand better what's kind of preventing better uptake of the data among specialty crop producers. And ultimately, these data should be geared towards making impact. So how does our data sort of inform the decision making of specialty crop producers and help them have more sustainable and profitable businesses in the end? That's ultimately what we're after here. So kind of just a little bit of a backdrop there, but this was a piece that we put together, this diagram, just kind of trying to get our brains around, what are all the decisions making, the decision points that specialty crop producers make in their production and marketing. And when you really start to think about it and look at it, there is a really complex network of information and influences that folks have to navigate to really make good decisions. And that also kind of is colored by lots of different internal factors. So you might be someone who has a higher or lower risk tolerance in terms of your business decision making. What are folks' proximity to local markets that can sustain their business? Are households working off farm to make ends meet? All these kind of internal factors really have a huge influence on the business decision making. Of course, there's external influences like consumer preferences, yeah, market demands, and peers. One of the things that we found from this research was that, peer-to-peer learning is one of the kind of strongest forms of transmission of information when it comes to production and marketing decision making for specialty crop producers. So that's kind of part of the backdrop here of why I wanted to launch this project. And just to kind of dig in a little bit more, when you think about all the decisions that producers make, just on the production side of things, it's a bit overwhelming, kind of thinking about the varieties to grow, volumes, seasonality, timing of production plans, pest and weed management, on and on and on. Just kind of on the production side of things is really kind of overwhelming. And then when you get to the marketing piece, and I should say, kind of on this production side of things, um, we tend to have better resources and information that's readily available for folks on the production side of things. So you can find lots of great extension and USDA and other resources that will kind of detail soil fertility management practices, irrigation systems, and things like that. But as we get into this marketing decision making, it becomes very scant in terms of good information. And pricing is just one of many decisions, key decisions that producers have to make. We have everything from thinking about wholesale versus direct to consumer marketing. What's your mix of enterprises? How many different varieties are you going to grow? How will you decide when it's the right time to invest in your business and expand production to reach maybe wholesale markets? Or is that GAP certification or becoming certified organic worth the effort and the cost and the sort of labor involved in that? So these are kind of the world of decision making and information that really wanted to kind of dig into a little bit more in Nebraska, knowing that we lack a lot of data here that could help inform our specialty crop and small scale producers who are selling direct to consumer at our farmers markets. Um, and so kind of to get started on this, I started by looking at other states to kind of take a look at what they had done. This is an example from Vermont. There's quite a few states, probably, well, a handful, four or five that I found that have kind of regular data collection around farmers market pricing. They tend to do that on a weekly basis throughout the market season. This example is from Vermont. It's actually their Department of Agriculture that does this on a weekly basis in Vermont. They collect a huge number of items. I was really kind of impressed and blown away by how many different items they are collecting. This image here, which I know you probably can't see the exact numbers, that's not totally fine, just kind of give you a sense, but this is just one of 3 pages that they have. So they do fresh fruits and vegetables. They do break it down on organic, certified organic versus conventional or not certified organic. So you can kind of get a sense of the pricing difference there. As a producer, that can be really valuable, obviously, if you're able to capture some real price premiums there as an organic producer at a farmer's market, that could be worth it. They also just kind of note some basic information about weather and attendance at the top of their reports as well. This is one from the University of Kentucky. This is kind of the one I've been modeling off of the most and trying to kind of just kind of the one that I took as a pretty simple starting place. Very similar to Vermont, not as many items that they're collecting. They don't get into quite as much detail, but they did add this kind of information here about, you can see in the red circle there, the number of vendors who had that item at that particular market. So it does kind of start to get at kind of supply issues and, how many different vendors are selling this particular item in these parts of the state. And what they've done is they put out weekly reports, and also they have done 3-year averages on pricing averages, which I found really useful actually, and something that I would like to kind of do down the line here in a couple years if I can. But so kind of a couple different examples there, similar to what we wanted to accomplish, just trying to keep it somewhat simple, and get some basic information out to start using in our programming. So here's kind of a look at what we did this year, 2025. This was kind of our pilot year. This list on the right are the 15 items that we collected pricing on. Got a couple of fruits, but mostly fresh vegetables. We really wanted to identify things that we felt confident would be found at most markets. Our goal coming into this was to have a stretch of, be able to collect prices from markets across the state. I'll get into some of the challenges of that here in a little bit. But you can see we ended up doing 41 different market observation data collections throughout the season, starting the very first week of May and then through the month of October. Again, trying to kind of capture as much of the information as we can, recognizing that, there are definitely markets, particularly in Lincoln and Omaha, that start in mid to late April and continue on a little bit past October. But for this year, wanted to kind of just get a process down and figure out how to make this happen pretty easily. Most of the data collected that I'll report on today is from the Lincoln Sunday Farmers Market at College View in Lincoln. And then we had data collected at 2 markets in Omaha, Exarban Village, and the Old Market. And then kind of a little bit more sporadically, we had some reports, data coming in from McCook and the Kearney area farmers market. Before the season started, we did some training for volunteers. A lot of this was a lot of the data collected, particularly in Omaha. Huge shout out to Dana Freeman, I see is on the call today. Dana was just hugely helpful organizing Master Gardener volunteers up in Omaha and helping them kind of collect this information on a weekly basis and reporting that out. So we did some kind of volunteer training and helped them kind of understand what we were trying to do and how to collect the data in a consistent way. And as I mentioned, we tracked these 15 items across all of the farmers market locations. So here's kind of it was a pretty basic paper and pencil kind of operation. We talked about and thought a little bit about, maybe we could use iPads or something like that with kind of some digital kind of entering everything into a spreadsheet directly. But for simplicity reasons and just due to kind of time and funding issues, we just kind of went straight forward into a paper-based data collection. We made some modifications to this throughout the season as we went along. Just everything was recorded. So basically, kind of like we asked folks to identify how many vendors were selling that particular item. We gave some directions on, how to distinguish between the different types of varieties that we were looking for. So, for example, we were we kind of had 2 different types of tomatoes. We had both slicer tomatoes per pound and then cherry tomatoes in the pint containers. Every week that I got the data, I would compile those in an Excel spreadsheet, and spent a good amount of time cleaning up the data for accuracy, and just kind of double checking things and making sure everything was as accurate as possible. And then for each month of the season, I averaged out the price for each particular item that it was at market. And kind of the big challenge here, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, just kind of the units were pretty different across the different markets and different vendors. So that was a lot of the work of kind of cleaning up the data, was making sure that I was actually comparing a pound of slicing tomatoes to a pound of slicing tomatoes and not kind of getting comparisons that were on different items that would really kind of throw everything off. I did include the average number of vendors with that item in the reports, and then we sort of tracked to like how long was the season for each particular item. So when do we first kind of see it appear at market, and when does it kind of fade out of being available at the farmers markets that we were at? All right. So some challenges here, and there were a few, but as I mentioned, the kind of used units of weight and the way that the items are being sold was by far the biggest challenge. There is a huge range in how folks will present their items. Some vendors will sell things each, like per item. Some will sell it per pound. Some will put them in a bag of unknown quantity and put them out there. So we really kind of had our hands full trying to figure out how best to clean this data up and figure out how to present it in a way that was comparable. At the end of the day, basically what we ended up doing is I didn't include anything in the analysis or in the averages that I wasn't certain was using the same unit of sales as the others. So the averages that I'll show you here in a minute are reflective of that. So we don't have probably quite as much data as I would have liked, but that's just kind of how it went for this year. There was definitely a range of consistency in terms of volunteers collecting the data. That's just the way it was. I think, some better training this year. Now that we've been through a whole market season, I've got a better understanding of how I think I can help folks note the data, note the prices, and make sure that everybody's collecting things in a consistent way. Also, just kind of consistency of the weekly collection is tricky in the summer months. Volunteers have lots of other things going on in their lives. These are markets that are typically on the weekends. And so we didn't get every single week. And that was true here in Lincoln, where I did the bulk of the data collection. I wasn't able to be there every single Sunday at the farmers market. I did have some student interns at the beginning of the season who helped out for kind of that first month of May, going into June. But after that, they were all off doing their own thing. So just kind of some things to clean up going into this next year. Definitely looking to have some more consistency in terms of catching the data every week and then making sure we're catching the right things when we do that. So this is kind of what our reports look like. We did individual monthly reports. Most of the other states I looked at were putting out weekly pricing reports, which is something that I would like to do if I can get the process a little more streamlined. It did end up being kind of time consuming for me to clean up the data and get it out every single week. So opted to go for a monthly price report. These are up on our website, foodsystems.unl.edu, May through October. You'll see a tab there at the top that says Farmers Market Pricing Reports, and you can kind of drop down and see all these as PDFs. We ended up reporting everything out as including high, low, and average prices, including the number of vendors that were selling that item in that particular month. And then as I mentioned, we did track kind of the season for each particular item. How long was it present at the markets that we were collecting at? So those are all available, foodsystems.unl.edu. Please take a look at those. If you have thoughts or suggestions about how we could report this out differently, or make it a little more usable for you, please let us know. I would be happy to kind of entertain some other ideas or formats, or if it would be helpful to have this in an Excel spreadsheet, for example, I'd be happy to do that. So please let me know, and we can make some adjustments going into this next year. So I'm going to take a look at just show you a couple of these just to kind of give you a sense of what the prices do. And then I'll get into some other details here. But so this is kind of just the look at broccoli. Again, the blue line is the high price that we observed, the orange, the low price, and then the average over the course of the month. And you can see broccoli stays somewhat pretty steady on that average price. There's some fluctuations on the high and low side of things, but it does kind of tend to even out with a slight decline over the months in the total average price, going from about $4 per bunch or per head down to $3 by the mid to late October there. Cucumbers a little bit more all over the place, kind of some wide range in terms of the high prices. Some of this, I think, again, might be some data errors. I need to go back to this, but I think these $3 per cucumber were for like the big English cucumbers. But in general, kind of your slicer, kind of regular cucumbers were coming in about $1 a piece throughout the market season with a little bit of variation there. Carrots, same kind of thing, some pretty wide stretches of high and low price, but does kind of even out there throughout the season. This is for a bunch of 5 to 8 carrots fresh at the market. Tomatoes, this is the per pound. I found this one kind of interesting. The average price stayed really pretty consistent throughout the season, not a lot of fluctuations. And folks, we did find slicing tomatoes showing up early June and lasting all the way through October. So seasonality wise, tomatoes out there a little bit longer than I expected them to be. I thought they might not show up towards closer to July. So we do see some markets and some vendors hitting fresh tomatoes by early June on the slicing side of things. Oops, I think my may have gotten, maybe I didn't include that one. Okay. So when we that's just kind of give you a picture of what some of those look like throughout the market season. But we did have some kind of expectations coming into this of what we might see. And some of the things that we wanted to take a look at would be, so one of the ideas that we had coming into this, that there would be a pricing advantage to vendors who were the first to market with their product. So that would be, so if I'm able to get a pound of fresh tomatoes to the market a couple weeks before the other vendors, I kind of have free reign to price however high I would want to, or I can have some flexibility in terms of how much I could price a pound of tomatoes or whatever that item might be. So kind of first to market would present an advantage. Kind of predicted that most products would decline late in the season in terms of their pricing. Just lots of conversations with vendors and being a farmer's market shopper myself, you recognize pretty quickly that the demand at the markets can really start to peter out towards the end of the season. So thought we might see some price declines associated with that. Was really interested kind of in this idea that with more vendors selling the same product, that we would see some competition and some prices coming down because of that. Talk about that here in just a little bit. And then just kind of had an expectation or assumption that urban markets would be higher priced than the rural markets that we were going to collect from. So, kind of some of the questions we were wondering about as we came in to this project and wanted to see what we could figure out here. So in general, on this first one, that there'd be a pricing advantage to vendors who are first to the market with a product. We did, in general, see that this was the case. I think for most items, the very first month that they were there, it did tend to have the highest average price for that particular item throughout the season. So there does seem to be some kind of pricing advantage for a vendor who can get to the market first and sort of claim that territory and say, I've got this product that folks are excited about, particularly if it's one of your more coveted items, the fresh tomatoes, in some cases like the asparagus, for example. We did end up collecting on asparagus for that couple of months that it was present at the market in late April, early May. And it did seem like that early pricing, the first time those products appeared at market, they did tend to have a higher price than as the market season went on. So some support for that idea. Um, will the prices decline as time goes on? Generally, we found that yes, that was the case. This chart here, I know it might be a little bit hard to see, but the ones that are highlighted were actually the only ones where the price increased as the season went along. So, for example, green bell peppers started out at about $1.17 a piece on average, and then ended up close to $1.60 per green bell pepper, so about a 36% increase. But in general, everything else pretty much declined over the course of the season, and sometimes fairly significantly, 25% drop in the price of broccoli throughout the season. Watermelon, and these are kind of the ones that I sort of expected, like a watermelon, you get to the end of the season, there's only so many weeks that those are present at the market. That price starts out pretty high at about $10 a piece and then starts to come down over time. So in general, we did see that prices did decline throughout the course of the season, except for a few of these other ones that are highlighted here, the onions, potatoes. And I think the case for the onions, they're so low priced to begin with. There's not much room for them to go down much more. Um, and the salad mix, a half-pound salad mix, is what we were reporting on, stayed roughly the same throughout the season. Um, and I think that one's just kind of a high value item that doesn't really decrease in price anyway. So still trying to dig in and understand those kind of changes a little bit better, but that was kind of what we saw. In terms of the increased competition idea, the number of vendors, so this chart gets a little messy to look at, but this is basically the green beans, but I've added in this light blue line here, which shows the number of vendors per month on average that we saw selling this particular item, and it just kind of all over the place. And so nothing that we collected, I think, supports the idea that more vendors means lower prices. I think what we saw was that vendors tend to set their prices at the beginning of the season, and they stick with them for the most part throughout. And so I think when we see that there's kind of more vendors selling the same item, there was, in some cases, the price did seem to come down a little bit when that happened, but I think that's more a factor of we just have more data and the price is kind of leveling out a little bit. When you get to situations, at the beginning and late in the season, and there's only a couple vendors selling an item, it's a little bit hard to make clear statements about what's going to happen if we add more vendors. But in general, what we weren't able to say that more vendors tended to lower the price. In fact, in some cases, I think what we're able to see is that the more vendors there were, sometimes the prices went up. And I think you get some pretty big variations in how people price certain things. And so when you add some of those folks who tend to be on the higher side of pricing, that can really bring the overall average up. And so didn't really see that this was the case. Curious to dig into this more in future years and think about this a little bit more. But for right now, I'm not able to say that that was the case. Unfortunately, we just didn't really have enough data to make a reasonable comparison between urban and rural markets. That's definitely something that I'm really interested to dig into this coming year. We had a lot of data from Lincoln and Omaha, and kind of sporadic data from a few other more rural locations. It just didn't really give us enough to dig into and say there's a clear difference here between these two. So hoping to dig into that more this coming year and see if we can get some more consistent rural data out there and make that comparison. I think we would probably find that the urban markets tend to be a little higher priced, but can't really report on that just yet. So in general, as I mentioned, kind of both from the data and from conversations with vendors, there's really, excuse me, there's little in the way of dynamics in pricing. As I mentioned, a lot of the vendors I spoke with, they kind of set their prices at the beginning of the season. They don't really change them that often. which is, a good strategy. If you know your production costs and you know kind of where you need to be to turn to be profitable, sticking with that is a good strategy. But I do wonder about, kind of missed opportunities to be a little bit more dynamic in pricing. That might be things like, if you are the first to the market with a particular item, would it behoove you to bump up 10, 15% on your prices, 20%, whatever it might be, just kind of capture some of that early season demand from the consumers. Um, as I mentioned, not enough data to really compare urban versus rural, but hope to do that this coming year. I think one of the things that stood out to me is I was surprised by how early some of the products were showing up at market and how late into the season they went. So one of the things I want to kind of look into and analyze a little bit more is just kind of how some of that, what we're seeing in terms of when folks actually show up with products at market, how that compares with, for example, there's a lot of seasonality calendars out there for consumers on, you know, tomatoes are available this time from this month to this month. I think we could probably inform those a little bit and broaden out those availability calendars and seasonality charts and things like that to help folks really understand that, we've got access to fresh local produce 10 plus months out of the year in most of the state. And I think that would surprise a lot of people. So we do see quite a pretty big range of dates in terms of when stuff is available. And then again, kind of that impact of number of vendors and price of an item, not entirely clear, but something that we really want to look more into in the coming years. And to that end, so kind of what we're thinking for this year, we'd very much like to continue with what we've done this year with data collection in both Lincoln and Omaha markets. We can do those relatively easy. I would love to add 2 to 3 rural markets with consistent weekly data collection, kind of spread those out across the state a little bit. If we could get, Kearney and Scotts Bluff and McCook and some of these folks, some of these locations, just to give us a bit of a spread across the state to be able to say something about any pricing changes as you move from east to west. Interested to broaden out the array of items that we're collecting on. There's a lot of interest in prices for eggs, ground beef, things like this. Obviously, with consumer prices, retail prices going up, I think a lot of people are increasingly interested in what the local farmers market pricing is like and how it compares. And so would like to kind of broaden out our items and pick 3 or 4 things that are not fresh produce items that we could add to the list here. I think there's one of the things that I kind of was really interested in as we started doing this was just kind of there's all these very, very seasonal items that come up at a farmer's market that really sort of mark moments in time throughout the market season. And so asparagus is a good example. I think people get really excited when asparagus shows up at the farmer's market. It's a marker of spring. People use it in a lot of spring dishes and, around Easter and all these kind of different meals and preparation and a lot of cultural things like that. And it's a very short window item. And there's quite a few of those that pop up throughout the season. Sweet corn being another one where it just kind of starts appearing mid to late season, and folks really are excited about it. So, like to kind of account for those things, have some capture some of those prices as well. And I think maybe a big one, I started working on this over the winter, still kind of making headway here, but comparing against retail prices and to really kind of speak to the affordability narrative around, local food and direct to consumer marketing and things like that. Again, as we see retail prices climb, there's been some indications that might be a little bit closer than what a lot of folks think in terms of comparison between fresh farmers market items and what you find in the grocery store. And USDA has started putting out retail pricing reports in the last year or two. And so kind of started compiling those and looking at that so we can start comparing what that might look like between the two. So that's kind of what I'm looking to for this coming year. Would love to answer any questions or discussion with folks. My contact information is here. This QR code will take you right to those retail farmers market, or excuse me, those farmers market pricing reports on our website. Please take a look. Let me know what you think and if there's anything I can do to improve those. I'm all ears. So.